President, Dr. Teller, in urging the Senate to reject the nuclear test ban today, said that it weakens American defenses and thus invites attack.
Now, to anyone who works in the laboratories today, a 30 megaton weapon is perhaps not as sophisticated as a 60 or 70 or 80 megaton weapon. But it's still many, many, many times, dozens of times stronger than the weapon that flattened Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How many weapons do you need and how many megatons do you need to destroy it? I said in my speech, what we now have on hand without any further testing will kill 300 million people in 1 hour. Now that's and I suppose they can even improve on that if it's necessary.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all
the controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is author Douglas Horn. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 046, JFK's Last 100 Days. Our guest tonight is historian Thurston Clark, who wrote JFK's Last 100 Days, The Transformation of a Man, and the Emergence of a Great President. Thurston will be with us next in the midnight hour. But first, a little cleaning of the castle before we begin. Now, we're pleased to let you all know that we can now be heard on Spotify, and before the week ends, I'm expecting to also be on iHeartRadio. So our contact and social media information can be found in the closing credits to the show, as well as on our website, midnightridernews.com. And once again, I'd like to encourage the iPhone users out there to find us on the Apple Podcast app. That's the Apple Podcast app. Now, guys, it comes with the phone. It's free, and it's already there. So find us on there. It's a much easier way for you to hear the show, and we'll be right back with Thurston Clark.
Hi, this is Ken Thomas, co-author of The Octopus, author of Mind Control, Oswald and JFK, and Trumpocalypse Now. For more on conspiracy and parapolitics from JFK to Trump, listen to episode 34 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
Thurston Clark is a distinguished historian and author of 12 books, which include 2004's Ask Not, The Inauguration of John F. Kennedy and the Speech That Changed America, 2008's The Last Campaign, Robert F. Kennedy and the 82 Days That Inspired America, and 2013's JFK's Last 100 Days, The Transformation of a Man and the Emergence of a Great President. Interestingly as well, he's the father of Sophie Clark, who won Survivor South Pacific in the show's 23rd season. Now, he's with us tonight to discuss JFK's Last 100 Days, so let's begin this journey together now. How are you this evening, Thurston?
Very well, thank you.
And thank you for being on the show. Now, the period of the last 100 days is not something that can really be planned for when the expectation was that, at the very least, the Kennedy presidency would still have another 14 months. It's not really like the first 100 days when a president has a designated plan for the specific time period. But one of the things that makes your work interesting is that the story begins with a personal tragedy and not a policy directive. John and Jacqueline Kennedy would have a son named Patrick. Well, sadly, he would pass away 2 days later on August 9th, 1963. How did this transform Kennedy as a man and a husband?
Well, Patrick's death was a real marker in the relationship between JFK and Jackie. And she was in the hospital after having the birth. He was born prematurely. And she was in the hospital in Cape Cod, and he rushed up and saw her. And then Patrick was taken by ambulance up to a children's hospital in Boston, and Jackie was too weak to go up there, so JFK went on his own, and he spent the final hours with his son. In fact, was holding his hand as he died. You've got to remember that Jack Kennedy was someone who was brought up in a large family of many children, and that really defined his character. And he and Jackie wanted to have more than two children. I mean, she had already had a stillborn baby, Arabella, just after they were married, and then she'd had a miscarriage, and then she had Carolyn, and then her son. And so this was, I mean, Jack Kennedy was very excited to have another child, and particularly when he found out he was having another son. And so the whole experience there really devastated him. And afterwards, when he came back, there are some very revealing photographs that were taken of him after he went and picked her up at the hospital in Cape Cod. And the photographs show him and Jackie walking arm in arm and holding hands. And these are rare kind of photographs. They're just not seen before. In fact, when she kissed him before during a campaign appearance in New York, he had maneuvered her so the photographers missed him. Anyway, even old friends had said that they had never seen them hold hands in public. But yet, after helping her climb into that convertible outside the hospital in Cape Cod, he suddenly rushes around to the other side. He reaches across the seat. He grabs her hand. And seeing that, Jackie's Secret Service agent, Clint Hill, who was very close to her, called it, quote, a small gesture but quite significant to those of us who were around them all the time. And this hand-holding was not the only sign that their relationship changed after Patrick's death. In fact, between August 14th and September 24th of 1963, when she returned to Washington, he spent 23 nights with her. But when he returned to Washington, he spent 23 nights with her, either at Cape Cod or Newport, flying up at midweek, something he'd never had done before. And Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's close advisor, who understood their reluctance to reveal their feelings, saw these feelings falling away, and after Patrick's death, he said they became, quote, extremely close and affectionate.
Wow, and I can't even imagine how hard that is to have the weight of the world on your shoulders and then to lose a child at the same time. And there were a few presidents who have lost children in office. I'm thinking of Lincoln right away, and he was really transformed by it as well. And we all know the stories that have swirled for years about Kennedy's personal life and his romantic predilections, we'll say. But this has to cause some introspection as a husband as well.
Oh, I think so. And, this was also the time where Jackie had really pushed him to agree to build this country house that they had out in the horse country in Virginia near Charlottesville. And he didn't really like it that much, but he was willing to go ahead with it and went out a few weekends before he was assassinated. And that was another sign that they were getting closer. And it's not just Arthur Schlesinger, but Ben Bradley, who was later became, as we all know, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post during Watergate, but was very close to the Kennedys, noticed them becoming much closer and more affectionate during these final months. Now, my book, because of the 100 days, it starts with the beginning, which is really the death of Patrick, but in fact, the two events that inform the whole 100 days, that really that influence Kennedy, are these two speeches that he gave back-to-back in June. The first was his famous civil rights speech when he announced that he was finally going to send a civil rights bill before Congress, and he gave a very emotional speech about civil rights. And then he also delivered this landmark speech at American University in which he announced that he was going to hope to negotiate with the Soviet Union a test ban treaty, which in fact was negotiated within a month, and it would be the first agreement to limit nuclear arms since the beginning of the Cold War. And a lot of Kennedy's 100 days after that, and after Patrick died, were devoted to trying to persuade Congress to approve the test ban treaty, which they did, and also to vote for the Civil Rights Bill, which did not yet happen and would only happen under Lyndon Johnson. But what's sometimes been ignored is that Kennedy made some very important, a lot of important progress on that in his final weeks in office.
Yes, and it appears that JFK was working towards some kind of détente with the USSR, the Russians, and I want to ask you about that thawing of the Cold War, especially in terms of the space race, the wheat deal, and the test ban treaty of '63. Why do you think that JFK believed in détente, and what evidence do we have that he was going in that direction in the last 100 days?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that happened. Just after the test ban treaty was signed in August, and of course it still had to be ratified by Congress, a couple of other things happened. One was the agreement to set up a hotline between the Kremlin and the Pentagon to try to avoid any miscommunication. We had come, of course, very close to a nuclear exchange 9 months earlier in 1962, in October, and this had really not just frightened Kennedy, but it had also frightened Khrushchev. And there was a secret correspondence between Kennedy and Khrushchev after the missile crisis throughout the early months of '63, which was one of the backdrops to the test ban treaty. And so the détente was not just the test ban treaty, but there were other things. There was trade, there was the hotline, and also there was a very unusual speech that Kennedy gave, unusual and shocking to some people, that he gave to the United Nations in September of 1963. Now remember that for Kennedy, the space race was one of his signature programs, that he was the one who had said that he was, as were all Americans, first shocked by Sputnik, but that was before Kennedy was president in the 50s. But then there was Yuri Gagarin, who was the first man to circle the Earth in 1961, and Kennedy had then announced his program to send an American to the moon before the end of the decade, which of course happened. And so when he goes to the UN, one of the reasons he did this was because I think he had been so chastened and worried about how close he had gotten to a nuclear exchange with Khrushchev in 1962. He proposed that the first moon mission include a Russian astronaut, and said that in other words, let's do this together. Part of it also was that the moon program was costing a lot more than Kennedy had imagined, and he was being pressured to scale it down. So there was also the idea that maybe if you cooperated with the Soviets, that it would cost less money. But it was a big shock, and it was front page news that he wanted to do this. And there were other evidence of his willingness and eagerness to kind of exploit this détente that had happened in the last couple of months, and mainly because of the test ban treaty. And people, I think, forget this, because it hadn't been entirely firmed up, but he was planning to visit Moscow in January or February of 1964, and if he hadn't been assassinated. And I like to think that that would have been kind of, in a way, like Nixon's visit to China, that it would have been a breakthrough, and that Kennedy was very eager then in fact, he wanted to be the president who ended the Cold War. I mean, Kennedy was looking for heroic things that he could do. He'd been a hero in World War II. He'd won all kinds of medals and awards, and he proved his bravery. But he knew he wanted to be a great president. And great presidents like Lincoln and Roosevelt had wars. The only war Kennedy had was the Cold War. And so if he wanted to be numbered among the Franklin Roosevelts and the Lincolns, his path was to settle the Cold War. And I'm convinced that that's what he had set his sights on for before the end of his first term.
Absolutely. And now let's move from the Cold War to an increasingly hot war in Vietnam. You tell an important story of John Kennedy visiting Saigon in 1951. This trip had a significant influence on JFK in the way he viewed Southeast Asia, yet there seems to be a contrast in the way he views Vietnam in the campaign of 1960 and the way he viewed it in 1963. So what did the 1951 trip show him, and how had his position on Vietnam transformed by his last 100 days?
Well, the trip that he took with Bobby Kennedy convinced him that the French were on the wrong side of the post-World War II nationalist revolutions across what was then called the Third World, and that they were fighting against history, and that they needed, that nationalism was going to overcome colonialism. Now, when he took off, when he ran in 1960, one of his campaign issues was the so-called missile gap, and the idea that Nixon on Eisenhower had allowed America to get behind the Soviet Union, which turned out not to be true in the end. But Kennedy was a kind of realistic but a cold warrior. And he did increase the number in his first couple of years in office. He increased the number of American advisors in Vietnam. They went up to 16,000. And he also, in addition, he allowed American helicopter pilots to ferry South Vietnamese troops into battle. So these were escalations, but they were minor ones. And his advisors during this period, Maxwell Taylor was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Robert McNamara, who was his Secretary of Defense, he sent them on a mission, and there was another mission, and they all came back and recommended an escalation and more American troops. And he was determined not to do that. He rejected that, and we have enough kind of evidence with conversations and papers of people who talked to him at the time that he was determined not to send, that he would send advisors, but he would not send U.S. combat troops into Vietnam, which is, of course, what Lyndon Johnson did in 1965. And also, slightly before his death, he had told a number of people that he was determined to wind down the war. I think, and I think the weight of historians who've investigated this is that Kennedy would not, if he'd been reelected in '64, would not have kind of immediately terminated all American assistance to the South Vietnamese government. But it's very unlikely that he would have ever sent combat units to fight in Vietnam, and that we would have had, as we had with Lyndon Johnson, 500,000 U.S. troops there, and thousands of people, hundreds of people being killed every week. I mean, he made this so clear to to his friends, to his people in his administration, that it just, I find it impossible to believe that he would have done what Johnson did. And he was also much more secure about his own abilities in foreign affairs and in military affairs, whereas Johnson had no confidence in his foreign affairs knowledge or abilities or military abilities, and he was much more likely to defer to his advisors. I mean, quick move back to 1962 in October, when during the first meetings of the ExComm, the committee that Kennedy assembled to assess what should be done about Russian missiles being discovered, nuclear missiles being discovered in Cuba, that it was almost unanimous that people wanted us to make a first strike, to attack them, to start a preventive war, and that Kennedy refused to go along with it. And it was only later that they came around to his solution, which ended up being a kind of quid pro quo with Khrushchev of dismantling American missiles that were close to the Soviet Union in Turkey. So I think that given Kennedy's willingness to buck Robert McNamara and McGeorge Bundy and the rest of them, I can't believe that, if he hadn't been assassinated a few years later, he would have bucked them again on Vietnam.
Well, you tell a story in the book where they actually call Kennedy a pacifist. Is that correct?
Yeah, there were people. They were. I think that was that Daniel Ellsberg? I can't remember who it was, but somebody in his administration. I think it was McGeorge Bundy. Said, there's only one pacifist in the White House, and it's you. And of course, why did he say that? Because Kennedy, unlike Bundy or I think McNamara, these people, was a World War II combat veteran, not just a veteran, but had been in combat in World War II. And he had his PT boat, his torpedo boat in the Pacific War, had been run over by a Japanese destroyer, and he'd lost a couple of his men, had died, and the others one of the others he had dragged swimming hours with a badly burned one of his crewmates, holding on to the strap of his life jacket in his teeth. And this, Kennedy was a genuine World War II hero and combat veteran. And not only that, of course, his older brother had been killed in the war. Had died flying a very hazardous mission out of England to bomb Nazi submarine pens on the coast of France. So Kennedy knew what combat meant, and he felt this strongly. So he was not someone who was going to send people put them at risk lightly. And I think that's one of the reasons that he was very skeptical of people like, and Johnson was also more of a hawk, but McGeorge Bundy and McNamara, who wanted him to get more deeply involved in the Vietnam War.
Right, and one more thing I wanted to ask you about that. Now, there's been much debate about the murder of Diem in Vietnam.
Yeah.
There's been talk that JFK supported that action, and there has been some who have claimed that he did not support that action, but that some in the State Department, men like Harriman and Henry Cabot Lodge, absolutely supported it. So what's the real story on this?
The real story is still somewhat foggy, but we can see some of the outlines of it. He had sent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who he had defeated in 1952, for the Senate seat from Massachusetts. And there'd been a long-standing feud, well, I don't know about feud, but certainly competition between the Kennedys and the Lodges. The Lodges were the old Boston Brahmin, and the Kennedys were the Irish upstarts. And Lodge then became, of course, he became Richard Nixon's vice president. And, he ran with Richard Nixon as his vice president in 1960. And some people think that Kennedy offered him the job of ambassador to Saigon, which he did in June of '63, because he knew it was a kind of thankless position. President Diem was a Catholic in a country where Catholics were 12%, 15%, and the Buddhists were 85%. Without getting into too much detail, there were a lot of demonstrations, and Diem put them down pretty brutally. And there's that famous photograph of a Buddhist monk pouring gasoline over himself and setting himself on fire that moved Kennedy as well. But Kennedy, what happened was, you have to remember that in the 60s, the communication between Washington and the State Department and an ambassador, the ambassadors had much more latitude then than they do now. And basically, Kennedy was kind of neutral about whether Diem should go or not. I don't think that Kennedy, he didn't sit down the way some of his detractors have said, let's get rid of Diem, and gave orders for that to happen. It didn't happen that way. It was more, Lodge was intriguing and basically saying to the South Vietnamese generals who finally got rid of Diem, well, if you do it, in fact, he said this in a cable, if you do it, we'll deal with the next government. In other words, so we're not saying go ahead and do it and we'll support you, but we're saying that if you do it, we'll accept, the government that emerges from that. And what Kennedy didn't understand, and he was very distraught when this happened, we know this because we've got him on tape talking about it a couple of days later, is that when Diem was overthrown, he was assassinated by the army officers who had gotten rid of him, by General Big Min, who later plays a big role in Vietnam in the final days of the war. But anyway, I don't think the idea that Kennedy gave orders to have Diem overthrown and then assassinated is not the case. But he didn't give orders against that happening. He really he was willing to let things play out as they would in Vietnam, and that's what happens.
We are talking to Thurston Clark, the author of JFK's Last 100 Days, The Transformation of a Man and the Emergence of a Great President. So we're going to move 90 miles off the coast of Florida now as we discuss Kennedy's relationship with Fidel Castro.
Yeah.
Now, we know that JFK was creating a back channel to Castro towards the end of the presidency, which is another example of JFK's movement towards détente, and this would have surely eased tensions within the hemisphere had it had more time. At least that's what I believe. But I'm curious as to the when, why, and how this back channel began.
Well, it started with getting with a lawyer, Donovan, who was a lawyer in New York, and the idea was to get the Cubans who had taken part in the Bay of Pigs operation in 1961 when they tried to overthrow Castro, and a lot of them had been captured, and the Kennedy and the American government was trying to get them released. It felt a responsibility towards them. And finally that happened, and as a result of that, a dialogue was set up between this lawyer and Castro. And Kennedy was very intrigued about turning Castro into a kind of Tito of the Western Hemisphere. Marshal Tito was the leader of Yugoslavia. He was a communist, but he had become he'd become a kind of independent communist. He was not completely allied with the Soviet Union, and certainly not with China. And so he was the kind of person the West could deal with, and it was a softer kind of dictatorship. And Kennedy felt that there was an opportunity if we, made the right moves, maybe did something with the embargo with Cuba, that we could turn Castro into what Kennedy once called the Tito of the Western Hemisphere. And just in the last months before Kennedy's assassination, he had some conversations with a French, very left-wing journalist who was going over to see Castro and to interview him. And Kennedy met with him in the White House before he went to see Castro, and basically gave him some talking points that he wanted answered. And these are the kind of talking points that showed that, and Castro responded in such a way that gave the Kennedy administration the reason to believe that there was possible to have a kind of thawing of relationships. Now, after Kennedy's assassination, Bobby Kennedy tried to follow up on this and informed Johnson and about what had been going on, and basically Johnson shut it down. He said he wasn't interested, and the feelers, the whole thing came to an end. But why did it come to an end? Not because I think Johnson was necessarily more of a Cold War or anti-communist than Kennedy. He was just more unsure of himself and didn't think he could pull this off and didn't want to get involved in this. And so, as a result, the whole thing kind of petered out, I'm afraid.
And gosh, Thurston, I can't help but to think that had this been successful, history would have dramatically changed. I mean, we know that Kennedy had a keen interest in Latin America, hence the Alliance for Progress, and we know some of his greatest successes came one-on-one. But if he can change the relationship with Fidel Castro, then maybe Nikita Khrushchev wasn't far behind.
Well, that's but the Castro thing, I think, was a part of Kennedy's major goals to become a great president. I mean, you have to remember, this is a man who had been ill, terribly ill as a boy, spent months in hospitals reading everything Winston Churchill had read, reading the biographies of great men, and who was determined to become a great man and a great president. And as I said earlier, part of this was ending the Cold War with the Soviet Union, but part and parcel of that was, of course, having a modus operandi in Cuba. And settling the Cuban situation would be part of ending the Cold War. So it kind of all links together, as does reducing attention over the Vietnam War and not sending American combat troops and not escalating it any more than he already had.
Right, and you can see maneuvers that President Kennedy was making globally as well. He had an interesting relationship with the non-aligned world, and I'm specifically thinking of the Congo, especially before the suspicious plane crash of Dar Hammarskjöld. So what did JFK learn in Africa, and what can we learn about JFK through his actions specifically in the Congo?
Well, the Congo situation had happened before. I mean, the assassination of Lumumba had happened, I believe, before Kennedy took office. That was in 1960. The whole business that you have to realize with Africa is that in 1960, just before Kennedy took office, that there'd been a huge decolonization in Africa. That the French colonies, all the French West Africa and French Central Africa, had all been given independence. So suddenly, you had all of these new African countries. I mean, you had Senegal and Mali and Niger and Central African Republic and Cameroon, Gabon, Congo, Brazzaville, and on and on. They were all going into the UN. And there was this great hope that these would be. This was the beginning of a new, a new world. And, of course, in 1961, Kennedy starts the Peace Corps. And the Peace Corps sends a lot of these people, a lot of its volunteers, to these new African countries. Also, you have the British are beginning to decolonize. You've got Ghana is a new, well, that was 1957. But you've got all of these new third world countries, and many of them in Africa. And so Kennedy, probably more than any other president, was focused on Africa, partly because, of course, he is still a Cold Warrior, and he wants these countries to be pro-American rather than pro-Soviet. And Nkrumah in Ghana was a communist, and Kennedy, the idea was that these French colonies, when they became independent, they didn't want to have them, and Belgian colonies, because the Congo was a Belgian colony, we didn't want them to be in the Soviet orbit. But there was also the kind of idealism then, and I remember I was a very young teenager at the time, but remember being fascinated by Africa and by these new countries that suddenly were suddenly independent, and each of them, of course, had a vote at the UN. So Kennedy, it was a combination of idealism and realpolitik and Cold Warrior, focused more on Africa and the third world countries too, because there were countries in Southeast Asia that had recently become independent. Malaysia had become independent from Great Britain, and so I think that explains his interest. But there's certainly been no other president that's caught the imagination of the Africans more than Kennedy has, until probably Obama. And that's why Kennedy's assassination was probably nowhere mourned as keenly and as passionately as it was in West and Eastern Africa.
Well, I can definitely understand why. Sure, he wanted them to be pro-American, but for a reason. He wanted the pro-American movement to be a choice and not a demand, which I also think highlights his belief in national self-determinism.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded by your work that Kennedy wanted to open the doors of immigration even more to Africans and even more to those from the non-aligned world.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And Kennedy, we're having such a big debate about immigration now, and basically the debate goes back to the 1965 Immigration Act, which opened up the United States to immigration from a lot of third world countries and also Southern European countries. And it was pushed as a memorial to John F. Kennedy by Teddy Kennedy in 1965. And the original basis, the bones and structure of the Immigration Act of 65 had been proposed by John F. Kennedy in the summer of 1963. And he had written a very passionate book about immigration and about how Irish people had been discriminated against and how important it was to have immigration and that on and on. I mean, the immigration debate now, without John F. Kennedy, we probably wouldn't have had the 1965 Immigration Act, and we wouldn't have the kind of country we have today with so many people from China and India and everything else. I mean, before the Immigration Act, basically you could only have 100 immigrants from all of Asia. Extraordinary.
Well, yes, but he knew that the economy would also have to be robust to handle such an immigration plan. Now, domestically, JFK worked on a tax plan that would cut the marginal rates in an effort to make the economy robust. But now, there are some who have compared JFK to Reagan, and Republicans now always seem to laud the JFK tax plan. But what was really the idea behind it, and how did this actually happen?
Well, there's two things. One is, the tax bill, it's a little bit outside of my thing, as before the 100 days, but the tax, you have to remember that the marginal tax rate when Kennedy wanted to cut it was kind of 80 to 90%. In other words, if you made over $500,000 or a certain amount, the money above that was being taxed at 80 and 90%. So it was, and that was the way through the 50s with Eisenhower as well. So yes, Kennedy cut taxes, but look at the taxes that he cut. It's not like Trump or somebody cutting taxes from 30 for the top earners from 39 to 36. I mean, Kennedy was cutting them from 80 or something down, but not to 36.
Exactly, and I think that those on the right who point to the conservative tax plan also somehow forget to mention that the next step was to follow that with an expensive war on poverty.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was, again, that is a kind of legacy that Kennedy handed over to Johnson administration, like the immigration reform. I mean, he had already told his Heller, the head of the council, his Council of Economic Advisor head, that he wanted to turn himself towards doing something about poverty after he won re-election. And he was Kennedy, like Bobby Kennedy when he was campaigning. Kennedy was very moved by what he saw in West Virginia when he was campaigning in the primary in 1960 against Hubert Humphrey, and he was really shocked and moved. There's enough kind of testimony, anecdotal evidence, people who were traveling with him, that he wanted to do something about it. And he talked about West Virginia all the time. He talked about poverty, and that he had to do, that his government wanted to do something about it. And the first official act of his government after his inauguration, the same afternoon, was to increase the food stamps, the allotment of food, the amount of money that people could get, not money, but the amount of food you could get with food stamps. And he did that the same afternoon of his inauguration. And it went out throughout the administration. I mean, the official plates for the White House, he and Jackie made sure they came from a factory in West Virginia. So that was a continuing concern. It wasn't something he suddenly, kind of fastened on, but it was something that he wanted to do, and that there are plenty of documents at the time and conversations that he had to show that I think there would have been a Kennedy war on poverty. I don't know how different it would have been from Johnson's, but there would have been the same kind of thing after his re-election.
Well, I would like to think it would have been more responsible and sensible than LBJ's plan, but I guess that answer is really lost to the realities of history, and we've come to one of those realities now. We're going to talk about Dallas in 1963, and it was already somewhat of a hostile city in that year. Yeah. I mean, Adlai Stevenson had been spat on, and the wanted for treason posters were out. So why Dallas? Why go?
Well, he wanted to show that he could go there and be popular. He wanted to raise money. I mean, it was a fundraising trip. It was also a political trip to support Democratic candidates, to show that he could go to a place in a town in a state that was supposed to be hostile, and he could be popular, that he would get a wonderful reception, in fact, which he did. He went to Fort Worth and Houston, and he was very elated by the time he got to Dallas. He was very elated about how the trip had gone. And it was also the first time after Patrick's death that Jackie had, wanted to come with him, and she was enthusiastic about going along. So it was also the kind of trip together. It was part of, I don't know if it was conscious or not, but it was part of their kind of new relationship that had happened, the new closeness that had happened after Patrick's death. But he wanted to show that he could go to a place that people thought was hostile, and he could draw big crowds. He could be popular. he could raise money for candidates. It was, for him it was an act of, courage, bravery, moral courage. I don't think he thought it was physical courage, but there were certainly some worries about what might happen to him, and he was warned before he went by some of his advisors. And of course, before he went, Adlai Stevenson had been, who'd run for president in 52 and then again in 56 and was his UN ambassador, had been spit on and had been treated very badly in Dallas. And after that, Stevenson had tried to persuade Kennedy and had tried to get other people behind him, persuade him not to go to Dallas. But of course, you tell Kennedy something like that, and it only made it more likely that he was going to go, because he always, I don't think he had tremendous respect for Stevenson's courage or not. Whether I think he had somewhat of a blind spot towards Stevenson, because Stevenson was the last minute candidate, the people who wanted to stop Kennedy's nomination in 1960. But anyway, Kennedy made him UN ambassador, and Stevenson had this terrible experience in Dallas a few weeks earlier. So he tried to warn Kennedy, and Kennedy went ahead anyway. But that's it was a trip that Kennedy thought he had to make. It was the beginning of his re-election campaign. It was a thing to raise money as well. I mean, he was supposed to go to a huge meeting at the Dallas Trade Mart after the motorcade during which he was shot. So it was. He went against some of his advisors, but others, I think, thought that he'd be all right. Of course, then we hadn't had, the last time that someone had tried to. There'd been an assassination attempt on Roosevelt, and there'd been the Puerto Rican nationalists plotting who had attacked the Congress. So I think Kennedy, I think that people were more secure, cavalier about the fact that he could ride in an open car through a town like that, through Dallas, or anywhere really.
Well, the thing is, there had been recent plots in both Chicago and Miami, and I kind of think safety should have been the first concern. Am I wrong?
Oh, here's the deal. My book is about Kennedy's last 100 days, and it ends with the assassination. And so I know about that stuff, but I don't feel really confident about discussing it or refuting it or not. I took pains to kind of end the book with Kennedy's death, because it's really a book about what he did in his last 100 days and what he might have done. And it's not an assassination book. I mean, personally, I have always believed that it was one man, one gun, one plan. It was Oswald alone. But I don't get into that in the book, and I don't really feel confident about I know about the Chicago. I think the Chicago thing's pretty dicey, and the Tampa thing too. But I don't know. It's not my field of expertise, really.
Okay, I think that's fair. We can move on. But now I'd like to ask about your personal remembrances of November 22nd, 1963. Where were you? What do you recall? And how did you feel? Well,
I was, when it happened, I was 17. My parents had moved from one town to another into New York, and I was in a school in Massachusetts, a boarding school, and I was told I was practicing in a musical group. And somebody ran in, it was Friday afternoon, and said the president's been shot. And the school, the classes were over, and we just, watched TV for the next 2 or 3 days. And I was there. I remember I was watching TV when Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby. I think the whole thing really affected me more about a month later, when I came down. I came home for the Christmas holidays, and I saw how shocked and shattered my parents and their friends were. But we were all pretty. I mean, we were pretty. I remember I was going out with a girl at the time who was nearby, and I mean, she was just in tears. Couldn't talk on the phone. Was sobbing and crying. I think, that at the time, I had more faith in Lyndon Johnson than was probably warranted, given what eventually happened with his presidency and in Vietnam. But I do remember, I'll never forget, being told what had happened, and all of us just be absolutely shocked. And then we had speeches, and the students got up and talked, and the teachers got up and talked on Sunday. And a lot of the teachers just broke into tears at the time. And I think that was, for me, that was to see these people so upset, these adults. And I noticed in my book, when I went over the material and talked to people, what a lot of people remember who were in grade school at the time were their teachers bursting into tears and crying. And to have, if you're a 9 or 10-year-old and your teacher suddenly begins to sob in class, well, I think it makes a huge impact on you.
Well, had that day not occurred, I think 14 months later he would be giving his second inauguration speech. But I guess we can't really say. I guess we're not sure.
Yeah, I think there's very few people think that Barry Goldwater would have beaten John F. Kennedy.
What does a second Kennedy term look like?
Well, I think that he would have passed a civil rights bill, but it probably wouldn't have happened as soon as it did with Johnson, because Johnson had the effect of the Kennedy assassination. Kennedy wouldn't have had the sympathy from his own assassination to do a lot of this stuff, but I think he would have had a civil rights bill. I think there were some encouraging signs before he was assassinated, so I think there would have been a civil rights bill. I think that definitely the détente with the Soviet Union would have continued. I think he would have visited Moscow, which he was planning to do. I don't think there's any way that John F. Kennedy would have sent combat units into Vietnam. I don't know how many more advisors he would send, that's speculation. But the idea that there would have been, 3 years later, 500,000 American combat troops in Vietnam, I just don't think I don't think it would have happened. So that's it. I mean, he wouldn't have been there, or he wouldn't have been around for of course, the moon landing. That would have happened a year later, or maybe it would have happened during his presidency. And of course, the rest, who knows? But I think we can say some of the things that wouldn't have happened. I think the Civil Rights Bill would have happened eventually. I think there would have been a war on poverty, but it wouldn't have happened this quickly, and it would have been different, and I don't think there would have been combat troops in Vietnam.
Was he not also moving towards a policy of more openness with the Chinese as well?
Yes, that's a little less certain, but that was certainly something he was looking towards, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So if anybody out there would like to hear more or would like to know more about you or your writing, where can they go online?
Well, I'm not online anymore.
Okay.
I mean, well, they can, I have a website, and they can go to the website. But yeah, it's just ThurstonClarke.com.
And this has been Thurston Clarke, the author of JFK's Last 100 Days, The Transformation of a Man and the Emergence of a Great President. Hey, Thurston, thank you so much for being on the show tonight.
Thank you.
I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back.
Hi, this is Donald Jeffries, author of Survival of the Richest, How the Corruption of the Marketplace and the Disparity of Wealth Created the Greatest Conspiracy of All. If you are concerned about how the economic gap between the rich and the middle class continues to widen in ways that are both unfair and criminal, listen to episode 020020 of the Midnight Rider News Show to find out just how the richest survive.
the last 100 days. You know, it's not often that someone knows when their last 100 days is going to be. It's not a time period you can even mark, really, until day 100 ends. And as I said earlier in the show, presidents plan for their first 100 days. They're asked about it as soon as the election ends. What will you do in your first 100 days? What's on the agenda? But that's partially why Kennedy's last 100 days remain remarkable. You do see real transformation. You see it in Vietnam. You see it in his relationships with Africa and Latin America. Now, some would argue that it wasn't really a transformation at all, that he had always harbored these peaceful, self-deterministic tendencies. And to be honest, I might also agree with them. I guess I would say, though, that those views have been given a spotlight since the assassination, and now that we can mark the last 100 days, well, we have. But you know what I can't stop thinking? What if historians were going to judge our last 100 days? And what if we didn't know when that would be? So let's mark it with today. If you were judged on your actions in the last 100 days, would you be proud of the books that are written? What was the most positively impactful thing you've done? What was the worst? How have you been transformed and changed for the better? Maybe it's something we all should think about. Now, my last 10 days have not been good. My mom had been in some pretty bad health for a while, and after having a lengthy hospitalization about an hour away, she finally succumbed to the weight of it all. My mom passed away last Saturday. And to be honest, that's why you haven't really seen many episodes this month, and because that's what I've been doing. The visitation and the funeral were both last week, so now I fully plan on diving back into the show to give you your 6 to 8 episodes per month, as usual. And really, I need to do that because I need to do something I love, and what I love right now to do is this show. So thank you all for being there to listen to these episodes. Thank you to the guests. A huge thank you to both Brad Schreiber and Jeff Worster, who I had to postpone multiple times. But it's now time to get back to normal, and it's now time to do some good work. So from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace, and good night, Mom.
You can contact St. Patrick by email at midnightridernews@gmail.com. Join us on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. Follow St. Patrick on Twitter at MWN_St. Patrick. We are LinkedIn at S.T.Patrick. And don't forget to follow Midnight Rider News on your YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and many of your favorite podcast providers. This has been a production of MidnightRiderNews.com and St. Patrick. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. We'll see you next time, and be good to the night.